I want to call this segment 4 signs that it is safe to be vulnerable. Okay. And this is for all those individuals out there that struggle with insecure attachment, that want to be able to express themselves in emotionally honest ways, that want to make authentic connections with people, that are ready to push past their defensive posturing, and be able to connect on a heart-soul level with their partners. And if you don't know me, or this is your first time joining me here, my name is Brianna McWilliam, and I am an author, educator, and licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. I've been in the field for about 13 years now, and I am just wild about talking about love and attachment in adult relationships. And more specifically, I help individuals struggling with insecure attachment go from feeling fearful and confused to stepping into what I call their self-sovereignty and calling in those soul-shaking, passionate partnerships they want, without having to talk in circles around their feelings for hours or even years on end with no tangible result. And I do this using a psycho-spiritual approach to applying creative arts interventions in the framework of attachment theory. And my approach is called the MAC method, and that is mastery, awareness, and creativity, which is a continuous feedback loop between 3 major steps, and that is cognitive reframing, body activation, and arts-based experientials. So we're going to talk about how to know when it is safe to be vulnerable and when it is not safe to be vulnerable, because it is not always. When we don't have a good sense of those boundaries, or we're easily flooded with emotion, we can sometimes kind of equate vulnerability with a form of emotional leakage. And it kind of spills out uncontrollably and oftentimes in inappropriate situations. So I want to illustrate this particular video with a story. And I want to talk about Tricia and Andy. And this is in a heterosexual normative context. So Tricia and her longtime boyfriend, Andy, they had a fight before showing up to a dinner party. And Tricia has a more open-hearted attachment style, and Andy is, let's say, a more dismissive rolling stone. And so Tricia was feeling particularly insecure and wounded after this argument. And during that argument, she had raised the idea that, well, maybe they should take a break for a while. And it was really more so in an attempt to inspire Andy to kind of fight for the relationship and be like, what do you mean? We can make it work, right? Instead, Andy responded kind of quietly and said, you know, that may be something to think about, rather than dismissing the idea outright. And so Tricia felt particularly stung and tender. And when they got to the party, she also got a little drunk. And she started telling these slurred jokes, which were really thinly veiled digs at Andy. And she also started sharing intimate details of what she described as their less than exciting sex life, while trying to kind of recruit the partygoers to her side, in essence. And so when Andy heard and saw what she was doing, he kind of grabbed her arm firmly and spoke in a harsh and kind of reproachful tone in her ear. And he said that she was making a fool of herself, and she was embarrassing them both. And if there were ever any question left in his mind about taking a break from their relationship, she had just made the decision for him. And so naturally, Tricia felt very triggered, and she began to cry uncontrollably in front of everyone. And later she felt humiliated, and she couldn't bring herself to speak to the friend that had hosted the party for months. And so here, Tricia struggled to contain her emotions, and ultimately her boundaries became too loose, and she drank too much as a way to escape the feeling of overwhelm, but it only exacerbated the issue. And equally, it also is important to consider that if we have gotten to the point where we are cutting ourselves off from our emotions for fear of this type of flooding, our boundaries can also become too rigid, and then we start to appear invulnerable. And that's also super hard for anybody to relate to. It's a turnoff because you wind up coming across as cold, crass, aloof, insensitive, rude, uncaring, or too intimidating and unapproachable. So for example, when Tricia finally reached out to her friend to apologize for how she had acted at the party, the friend told her that a couple of the guests had asked if Tricia was in a domestic violence situation because of her emotional intensity and because of the cold and unemotional way Andy had grabbed her arm. Okay, now Andy had never been physically assaultive towards Tricia, but their dynamic suggested that there were power plays going on. So it's really important to ask yourself, when you are diving into deep structure communications, or you are wanting to express yourself more vulnerably, to understand when it is safe for you to be vulnerable. And before becoming vulnerable in a relationship, be aware of what a partner would need to demonstrate to you first before you're willing to make yourself available in that way. When is it not safe to be vulnerable? And if it's hard to think about that, just think about in the past when it hasn't been, right? Why are you confused about that now? Have you ever been in a situation where you suspected it might not have been safe, or you even knew it wasn't safe, but you exposed yourself anyway because you hoped that you would get some kind of reaction from it? Okay. Now, each person is going to have their own individual responses to these questions, but today I want to provide a basic template for those that are truly lost in the dark with this. Okay, and this is where we're going to get into those 4 signs that it is safe to be vulnerable. Okay, and of course you can add to this list. Anybody who would add to this, I invite you to type that in the comment box as well. So the first sign that it is safe to be vulnerable is that you have a firm grasp of your boundaries and you feel connected to the emotions that you want to share in a way that is authentic and self-advocating, as opposed to self-abandoning, criticizing, or blaming. Now, Tricia's use of alcohol to escape her insecure feelings is actually a form of self-abandonment. She's trying to numb herself out, right? And cracking mean-spirited jokes at Andy's expense is criticizing and blaming, and it's not really authentic. So she might have felt extremely vulnerable in that moment, but she wasn't communicating vulnerability. Now, the second thing is that you understand that the appropriateness of your context and situation, right? You understand that it is appropriate, and you feel assured that this level of exposure is not going to negatively impact your short or long-term goals or getting your basic needs met. Okay, so for example, Tricia hoped to make new friends at the party, but she only wound up alienating most of the guests because of her behavior. Okay, she also wanted to make Andy mad so that he would recognize his feelings for her. She thought that the anger would somehow spur his passion, but it only ended up inspiring the breakup. And regarding basic needs, imagine that Tricia were to act that way at a work-related event. Maybe she's up for a promotion, and suppose that she's trying to impress a potential client. If she were to behave that way, she'd be risking her rent and her grocery money. Now, the third sign is that you have a reasonable expectation of physical and psychological safety. Now, in certain abusive situations, this expectation may not exist, and being vulnerable in front of a predator or an abuser may actually inspire further abuse. Now, the last sign is that you know that in partnership, it's okay to be vulnerable when you have spent some time getting to know one another, and you're feeling as certain as you can be of the quality of your partner's character. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to expect that they're going to agree with what you are expressing to them, or even that they have to accept it. But you do know that however they do respond, that it's going to be with a sense of acknowledgement, respect, integrity, as opposed to dismissing you, denying your experience, blaming or criticizing you, or turning you into the bad guy for expressing your feelings, right? And these are more or less the telltale signs of emotional abuse. So those are the 4 signs. Now, please note that if you feel like you have made yourself vulnerable outside of any of these situations and you felt exposed and embarrassed because of it, I'm only sharing this with you because I want you to have more compassion towards yourself, okay? So just as it wouldn't be fair to quiz a child on a subject that they have never been taught, it wouldn't be fair to beat yourself up over something that you haven't adequately learned yet either, okay? That's not your fault, okay? But taking the action steps now to recognize and learn what it is that's going to help you move forward, that is your responsibility, okay? And so if you're watching this, then you have already started embarking on that journey, right? So I would love it if you'd let me know in the comments there below if you've ever had experiences like Tricia and Andy's experience, or arguments that panned out in that way. And what would be your biggest confusion around when it is and is not safe to be vulnerable?